Good morning, everybody. It's awesome to see everyone in person and to have such a full house. Thank you, James, for the insightful feedback, especially from developed world. And we know through the decades of the development of South African capital markets, a lot of our activity here stems from some of the initiatives, flows, and activity of global markets, in particular UK and European markets. So it's good to understand that and leading up to this panel. Thank you. Thanks. It's an honor to be on a panel with such esteemed South African industry participants, colleagues, and friends. Friends in that we get frank feedback, and that's what this conversation is about. It also represents a very diverse panel of the industry. So I'm thrilled to be joined on stage by Matt Rattray, the CEO of RMB Morgan Stanley, Nivedna Maharaj, the CEO of SBG Securities, Viwe from Vunani Securities, recently appointed CEO, so hot in the seat in terms of very tough markets, and then Erica from Navigar Securities and representing SAIS today, so South African Institute of Stockbrokers. My name is Valdene Reddy, and I'm Director of Capital Markets at the JSE. Also a long history in the market, so thrilled to be in conversation today. So a lot of our conversation stems around the future of stockbroking in South Africa, and we're not dissimilar to what James has highlighted. A very concentrated market. I got to speak to a few of you guys, and we have concerns such as addressable liquidity, just general liquidity and activity. This week has been dismal for South African markets, but in general, it's a tough year. So it's good to have a collective discussion because I think it's so much bigger than each one of our institutions or our entities in South Africa, and so it's good to unpack it. The concentration in the market is on multi-layered activity. So the top 40, top 60 names is what dominates trade activity. The brokerage concentration and consolidation has manifested over the past decade. And then we also have new participants and interests in our market in terms of asset managers, low latency clients, and a whole mix of clients. So defending that market quality and liquidity is imperative to get a catalyst for growth and change in our market. So today we're trying to unpack what the future of the broking business looks like, in particular for South African brokers, but also South African brokers into the rest of the world, because I think the world's so connected right now in terms of flows. And as Leila mentioned, in the absence of just fresh IPOs, the JSE is also looking to increase the addressable universe through a better pipeline of dual listings and to create that plumbing with the ecosystem here of connectivity, ease of access, and general flows. So today we'll cover a whole lot of challenges, both from local brokers, international brokers, trying to work through engagements in how we do the infrastructure and technology connections. Some of the challenges that we're facing in the regulatory domain, lots uncertain in the local arena, lots on the agenda, and then also how that comes back into the global network because we're trying to build that pipeline or deepen that pipeline. And then what are the challenges for a viable business broking model? And I think for each entity, they're different, but when we were doing the panel prep, it was also interesting to see, despite having an international or local presence or being a top 10 broker or one of our smaller brokers, there's similar challenges that face the South African ecosystem. So I'm pleased to have the panel with us, and we're going to kick off today with looking at what does the future of the broking business model look like. I'm going to ask Erica to kick us off and just some of your thoughts of what are some of the considerations within what a future business broking model looks like for South Africa.
Thank you, Valdene, and morning, everybody. I do believe that the South African market is at a cusp, and it's really at a crossroad, and I think we're at a real watershed moment where we're going to decide where our market's going to land. South Africa has its own issues which impact our markets terribly and have affected liquidity, have affected interest in South Africa and the relevance of the South African market. So looking at that, if we look at the whole picture end to end, we have to say, okay, everybody talks about listings, but you can't look at listings in isolation and IPOs. And the reality is if you don't have issuers and you don't have investors, we don't have a market. So I think it is really imperative that we make sure that whatever we do, we look after those. Without liquidity, our market's dead. What we do have to make sure too is that regulation is not, we aren't over-regulated. And unfortunately, I think in our regulation space at the moment, the lack of action has actually created even bigger challenges for our market and left us behind a lot of the international markets. So where do we see ourselves? I do believe that we have to look at our market and regulation and decide, are we trying to become an international broker and compete head-on-head with the internationals, or are we trying to ensure that there's harmonization in regulation, but we still have a nuance in our South African market? And with that being said, is every time we try and write a regulation, are we affecting liquidity? Are we affecting the smaller brokers? Are we affecting medium brokers? Or are we just going to become a wholesale broker? And so I think some of the questions that we need to ask and really be honest with ourselves is, there is no collective, collaborative blueprint across regulators, industry, buy and sell side. So everybody right now is sitting in their own bubble, I think, and working in their own spaces and trying to survive. And we're trying to change regulation that often does not look at the end-to-end unintended consequences. And so all the regulatory spaces that we need to check is how we're affecting liquidity, how we're affecting the ecosystem. And I think we have to take a step back and look at the ecosystem and get this helicopter view of the ecosystem to say, what does it actually look like and what do we want for South Africa? And whatever it is, we just have to be honest with it and say this is a wholesale market. We're only going to look at wholesale players and the rest of the players will become service providers or tap into the wholesale market? Or are we trying to make sure that it's a retail market and a wholesale market and there's enough space for everyone? But all the regulation that is out there has dire consequences, and I think people are making regulatory changes or don't understand the end-to-end result of regulation changes from end to end, and they don't understand the unintended consequences, as we saw with Reg 28. And so from our market, I think we have to take a step back. We all need to sit in a room. The diversity of our market is great. We have to understand one of the big things is competition. We know people talk about that collectively. We know we're waiting for FMA review. We know we're waiting for conduct standards of FMRs. And all of those have got huge, huge consequences. Reg 28 took a lot of money out of our market offshore. We could have done that a lot smarter. Yes, we want optionality, but maybe we should have had boots on the ground because this is South Africa and we've got nuances, skills, tax, growing South Africa, and maybe people should have had a presence in South Africa. And so we need to ensure that if we don't work together as a collective, we're going to have a very broken market or quite irrelevant. So where do I see the market? I see the market actually slowing down for a while. I am fearful that we become irrelevant or ETF market only, and so all our big listings are pushed offshore. We have to look at things like what does the CCP do? I know we spoke about, don't worry about membership, but this is South Africa. If you allow cross-membership, what does that do to the international brokers here? What does that do for skills here? Does everybody go sit offshore? If we allow equivalents and exemptions to equivalents, what does that mean? And all of those have huge repercussions. And I think we can't sit back and wait for the regulators to drive our industry. We have to decide where it should go. And I think we have to, as a collective, sit together and understand the end-to-end implications and make sure that we speak to each other and be honest. It doesn't matter. There will be fallout, but rather be honest and upfront so that people can change where they're going to. And I think we're lacking transparency, and I think a lot of the regulation is driving our market and not in the best possible way, potentially.
Yep. So on all of our roadshows, we do highlight the deep sophistication of our SA capital markets and promote the fact that there's deep and liquid markets, especially in hyper-volatile periods. However, liquidity is overarching as our biggest concern right now, and I think if that's the merit we hold it true to, it's one that we want to unpack. So Matt, I'm going to go to you next, please, publicly. So Matt's one of the top 10 brokers on the JSE and represents local and international firm as well. So Matt, from a liquidity perspective, what would you highlight as the biggest concerns and what can we collectively do to try and stimulate some of that or reposition, or are there initiatives that we should be thinking about that can help defend and grow some of the liquidity in SA?
Look, I think everyone's very familiar with the headwinds that we faced and some of the challenges over the last 2 years. And I think it's definitely had a direct impact on liquidity, that Reg 28 changes and the focus that the buyer side and SA has had offshore. I think that we've also going into the environment's changed as well. We've gone into a multi-exchange environment and a multi-venue environment. So, it's required a significant technology investment from a lot of the brokers, to have smart order routers or to have an internalizer. James alluded to it earlier. So I think there are, and these things require a lot of focus and a lot of technology spend. I think if you're a global player, you can invest a huge amount into that technology because you have the scale to deploy it globally. I think if you're a single market operator, you rely heavily on vendors and stuff to help you and assist you with that. So it's become a sort of race, a tech race in terms of getting execution costs as low as possible. I think that if you look at what our weighting's done in the MSCI, 10 years ago it was about 9 or 10%. Now it's just gone below 3%. And, those are the kind of things it's difficult to control. We can't control the macro and the interest in SA. But what we can focus on is, I guess, there's still a role to play for different players in the market. There is whether you are a content provider or whether you are a retail broker. The current environment makes it quite difficult to have the scale and model that requires the low execution costs that you can offer. So I do think the sort of tiered broking model and maybe retailer accessing the large, let's say global brokers or global banks will make it easier. So your expertise is your distribution channel and your client relationships. Focus on that and focus on getting them involved in the market, and then use a third party so that you get your execution costs as low as possible, and you don't have to worry about the change in regulatory environment or the technology investment. So I think the listing requirements is an area we can look at as well. I think that it's difficult because you need to strike the balance between making sure our market is still protected and held in very high regard, but also making sure that we don't make it too onerous for people to delist. We want to try and attract people to the pool of capital that is an SA market. There's a few examples, even with Billiton and Woodside, where they looked at the listing requirements and delisting, and maybe they would have changed their mind if they weren't so onerous, and we would have had another counter here to invest in for the local market. So I think there's definitely, all of us have a role to play in it. I think we focus on what we can control, but I do think we need to get more of, let's say, the mass market involved in the market and investing. We don't really have an investing culture in SA. We've got a very sophisticated insurance sector, a very sophisticated asset management sector. So I think we've got the expertise and the skills. It's just about attracting, let's say, those foreign listings, the foreigners to play, and then trying to broaden the market access for the rest of the country. So
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And then Viwe, maybe I can just go to you. Obviously, a different type of perspective in how you service the local market, but the same ecosystem, same types of flows, same types of clients. So maybe you can give us a perspective in contrast to what Matt has said of what you see as a big challenge and how you can stimulate just general activity from your business, especially from a tech perspective. That would be very interesting to know.
Firstly, let me say conversations like these where the JSE facilitates collaboration like this are ideal, because very often what you see happening is that we're working in silos, and each of us in the ecosystem is trying to survive even at the cost of the next in the ecosystem's demise. So what I'm thinking is that I like what you said, Matt, about being more inclusive in the approach, and especially as far as the fact that most of our populace in South Africa are quite financially illiterate. I think that it was you earlier who said that there's macro issues that we can't necessarily resolve, but I think that financial markets has a specific role that we can play in, as far as at a minimum educating the South African populace and putting that kind of power in the populace of South Africa that allows us to see the macro changes that we are wanting to see. So I think that something that is not given nearly enough attention in financial markets in particular, because we have an elitist approach to how we handle ourselves. We like our language. We want to be able to speak to each other. And if it's just two people in the room that understand what's being spoken about, that is ideal, which is counterproductive to an environment wherein you are wanting to stimulate an economy, one, and secondly, be able to grow a market. So I think that approach is something that we need to look into. As far as investments in tech, I laughed a few weeks ago when I had the opportunity to meet everyone on the panel, because as Matt was speaking, I got the shock of my life in realizing that even though we come from very different parts of the market, and as far as a size and market share is, the costs and the challenges that we are facing are quite similar. And if Matt, in his capacity as the CEO of one of the top three, is struggling with tech and what that cost would look like, how much more for a black broker who is part of a coalition of brokers who own or have less than 1.3% of the market share. I think that from a regulatory perspective, there's been a lot of changes that have happened in the market, and we have not necessarily at this stage caught up to those changes, and we need to perhaps look at being more nimble to those changes, as well as looking at more cost-effective technologies that are available that will enable us to push our business forward in the market to where we want to see it.
Thank you. And as we said, there's a SA macro overhang and then challenges within. But as an ecosystem, the capital markets represents a long history, not only of SA GDP, but just of liquidity for South Africa. So I think the collective mindset is important. And Matt, you also alluded to how can, some of the smaller brokers or retail brokers scale through some of the bigger brokers who have access to plumbing naturally from their general organizations and investments. Notwithstanding, and James highlighted some of the challenges in the European and UK markets, we see it with the US markets. There's a tangle basically with regulations, a couple of steps forward, some review and then some undoing. And then underpinned to that is the raft of regulatory changes that we are facing in South Africa. So all of that has costs, I think, complications to navigate. So Nivedna, maybe I can just ask you, how does it work in terms of the SA market, of how you guys or the ecosystem as a whole navigate some of the regulatory challenges that we are facing? One, some of them are pending and uncertain, and two, they change the business model, especially for a brokerage entity with the papers that are out. They're quite big and meaningful. So what are some of your perspectives from a regulatory perspective?
Okay, so I think there's a couple of disruption happening at the same time. Okay, so we have the macro events happening, the regulatory, we have tech disruption. Also, equities as an asset class by investors is also being reconsidered. A lot of other alternative assets are also in the play. So that's also another element that we need to take in consideration, how we innovate in kind of the product space as well to keep relevance in the traditional kind of asset classes and how we partner. I think with that amount of disruption and the amount of consolidation happening, it's definitely poses an opportunity. And coming back to Erica's point, and I think we're all saying the same thing, even ChatGPT, is how we collaborate and partner and play to our strengths. Because I think traditionally in the brokerage world, we tended to own everything front to back. So the entire business model, even brokerages versus some of the financial institutions, you would traditionally do everything. And I think now with the space of cost optimization, regulation changing in terms of how we need to operate, there is an opportunity to come together and see how we partner, and as in financial institutions, what I'm good at and what can I work with other third parties to bring to the market. I think if we don't change that mindset, it's going to be, we're either going to kill the market ourselves, and we need to, it's definitely going to force that kind of collaborative approach. So, yeah.
It's interesting in all domains, it's the same thinking. I mean, even as we face fragmented markets, not only from other exchanges, but also from local to offshore flows, etc., you have to also rationalize what is the right size for the market and what the market can absorb. So it's quite interesting, perspective, and fully agree that the collaboration or the partnership model works. I don't know, Erica, do you have any thoughts from a regulatory perspective? What would be some of our key enablers or concerns in the market at the moment?
Sure.
I see we've only got 30 minutes, so
That's a long time.
not really. So I think there are a lot of concerns from a regulatory perspective, and not because they're bad, but because of the cost of implementation and potential fallout. There are also a lot of opportunities, as Nivedna and Matt said. So I think if we just take a step back, we have to look at, we have no choice but to get some sort of blueprint. And so everybody understands where we're going from beginning to end, because everybody is working in isolation, including the regulators, and each regulator, the regs that they're making has an unintended consequence and actually has a tech consequence. And if we put them in piecemeal, they also create uncertainty, because as we're changing one system, so somebody comes with the other. So if we just go from end to end with the FMA review that's coming out, well, let's go to FATF, being on the grey list. Because we're on the grey list, there's a whole lot of regs from an issuer point of view and from a listed entity point of view, from a broker or accountable institution, is that ultimate beneficial ownership details. How are we going to get it and the cost of doing that? I spoke to a bank last week and they said it could cost them up to 60,000 Rand per company, not an individual, but per company, to actually onboard a client because of the in-depth rabbit hole they have to go into. And so that's the cost. And can everybody afford that? Particularly not. And it can take 6 months to a year to onboard somebody because of regulation. Again, that's not enabling. So we have to make sure that we don't try and overkill certain things. We've also got the FMA review that's coming out. In the FMA review, what does it look at? It looks at the SRO model, the self-regulatory model. Where does that take us? Who the regulators are going to be? Where's regulation going to be? We also have to be careful for what we wish for, because you can't have people making regulation who aren't practitioners and don't understand what we do from a day-to-day basis. So we have to ensure that we are part of it and we're driving it, and we're not waiting for somebody else to make the regulation. Because sometimes they write regulation in isolation without seeing what people do from a day-to-day. And again, that has a knock-on effect. We've got competition. So you've got the conduct standards of FMR, how we share information. So that is really important and has a huge knock-on effect of competition, multiple exchanges, multiple venues, and suppose dark pools, crossing networks, etc., etc. So those are regs. Then we've got regs from a settlement CCP point of view. We know that's really big. If we go into a CCP environment and go away from a cap-add environment, then what happens? Does that actually allow an open market for equivalents and a lot of foreigners leaving and trading offshore, and then foreign CCPs coming here, and then back-to-backing a whole lot of things there? What does that do to our tax base? What happens to STT, PAYE, skills? And so all of these you can't look at in isolation, and that's the problem. We tend to do that. From there, we go into post-trade systems. What are we doing about that? We've spoken about changing of post-trade, but it's a mandatory use of systems. It's what happens and the collective of how we're going to do that. But we have to work together, because we need to understand, for some people it works, and it plays its role, and it has a regulatory base. We also have to be careful of systemic risk. We have to be careful of the unintended consequences of changing all of these things at once, and then the fallout that there is nothing for smaller brokers to actually partake in, because they just can't afford it. And so we go back to the shared service concept. If we don't share in services and we don't come up with a collective idea and drive that shared service, trying to ensure that we can make sure whatever we do is best for South Africa. So I've got to a point now, every time there's a regulation, I try and wind down and say, who's it actually benefiting? Is it benefiting someone in particular? Is it from a conflict perspective? Or is it actually there to benefit South Africa? And I think every time we look at reg changes, we have to look at it in that light. And yes, we want to be fast, and we want to make sure that we can compete head-on with the likes of the UK and the USA and things like that. But maybe we should be learning from the Indian market, how they've grown their retail base, how tech has worked. And so maybe we should be looking at other things. But we can't copy and paste regs from other places without looking at our own nuances. So I think there's a lot of reg that worries us. And then we've got exchange control, clearly, Reg 28. That's huge. So all these things, the cost of doing business in South Africa, our labour law, our EE laws, and as soon as you allow equivalents and somebody can sit overseas, are there level playing fields? is that really fair? So again, it depends on what are we actually looking for and what do we want is best for South Africa. But we have to understand it. We have to take a look and say, okay, this is what we want. We do want to be competitive. There are these nuances. We do need tech. We do need to evolve. So how can we do it in a shared environment, making sure that there aren't unintended consequences? So I'm not saying that we mustn't move forward. We have to move forward, but we have to understand those consequences and try and find solutions, the best possible solutions. We can't let reg hold us back, and I think that's really important.
Thanks. So we've all referenced the Reg 28 changes, and we felt the consequence of that, and probably exacerbated so in downturn of markets last year with other external factors where there was just a general sell down in equities markets, in particular globally, in a more risk-on play into fixed income asset classes. So Matt, maybe I can just pick your brain a little bit, what do you think would be, specifically with the exchange controls and the Reg 28 impact to our market? James can correct this, but if you look at the developed world, for example, the UK, they're actually looking to reinstate a minimum of a 5% of onshore investment in the UK market, because only 4% of savings from the UK actually is deployed in UK equities, asset classes, or UK capital markets. And they've seen that shift to develop. So, you're seeing a little bit, a bit of a change while it's not the same breadth. I've been marketing that we still have 55% onshore, because that's quite a stat in terms of the deep and liquid, deep pools of assets here. But we didn't just see a downturn in a sell down in equities and bonds. We also saw those assets shift, I think, globally, which is harder to get back. And that has a read-through to skills development and management of offshore portfolios onshore, which is not here anymore. And the asset owners were quite firm about that. So maybe just some of your thoughts from a Reg 28 perspective, specifically with the ex-con.
Yeah, look, I think nobody really wants prescribed assets, and I think all of us are, we are in favor of exchange control liberalization. However, in this instance, I think consultation needs to take place, and I think given our market, there needs to be a phased approach. So I think going from 30 to 45% had a material impact on our market, on liquidity, on asset price valuations, on everything. And you see it, we track the quarterly SAIS numbers that come out, and you can see from Q2 2022 how everything moved. And I think it looks like about 42% now for the market. So there's an immediate shift, and most of that was funded by SA equities. So it's going to have an impact on the market. I think that if you think about the ecosystem and where we sit now, I think it impacted the buy side considerably in SA as well, because I think a lot of the asset allocators, once they've made the decision to move to that 45%, they actually farm that offshore to global managers. So a lot of global managers got some of that, and that obviously depleted the SA buy side as well, and had an impact on them. So I think we need to look at how do we, as a SA market, enable let's say skills transfer, some of the fees, so it helps with SARS, all these things, transformation, all the requirements that we have here in our market. If that money goes overseas, then we don't really see it. So we've got precedent in the broking industry where, the brokers are sort of domestically on the ground. Do we have teams on the ground that manage some of that? It's still got a global mandate, and do they manage some of that offshore? Because once it's left the SA ecosystem, it's gone. The second thing is I think that a lot of the guys are trading directly offshore with global brokers, and I think, that certainly helped. But again, it's not helping our local market. And then I guess we need to look at the listing space in SA and the global exposure. I know we've got the notes program that's working quite well. We've got IDEX futures, but are we doing enough in that space? Are we doing enough to say, how do we turbocharge this so that if are we going to have like global exposure or listed stuff that references offshore here? Are we doing enough in that space to make sure we are creating a bit of liquidity in some of those products? We're creating nice products that are open to the mass market, because at the moment, a lot of that stuff, it's only done at certain size and certain levels because there's costs implications for it. So how do we get those costs down, and how do we address that? Because I don't think there's going to be a walk back of that 45%, and so I think we need to try and figure out what is the new operating model, and how do we capture as much of that flow as possible, and keep the skills in country, or keep some of the, let's say, fees in country, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I think it's, absolutely, the costs down to help improve the sustainability and viability of our businesses, but also to shift some of the flows back from maybe new money or fresh money, especially with foreign investors underweight SA. We offer a lot of value, but then it comes back to the point we made earlier about SA relevance being a small percentage of portfolios and competing against the global norms. We did highlight quite a few times the nuance in South Africa also from a transformation perspective, which is another challenge in SA given the prescription that we have in our local environment. So Viwe, I don't know, and I know it's a challenge even for the local buy side in how they allocate their flows, one for access to flow, but then just in general in terms of what considerations are in the South African domain. So Viwe, I know this was a topic in our panel prep you wanted to discuss, so maybe you can give us some of your thoughts specifically from a transformation lens in the South African broking model.
Right. I think that we need to be intentional, quite intentional and cohesive about our approach to transformation. So far what we've seen is getting into rooms, having conversations, or somewhere in a syllabus is an instruction that or an intention that will transform the industry. And how we will actively transform it is by coming together, both the buy side and the sell side. In particular, a conversation has been roving mics for a while. Is one gets it even if you go and see clients. They'll ask you things like, why don't all the black brokers come together and make a big broking firm? One thing that I want to say in this platform is that those conversations have been happening in private. However, the stumbling block pertaining to those has been that there's no economies of scale because there's no real value there's no new value to unlock between the two smaller firms who were originally struggling with a smaller percentage of the market. What I believe will absolutely unlock value, however, is if we have a partner approach, something that I like to call a big brother approach, wherein the large stockbrokers that have the infrastructure partner with the smaller stockbrokers to make sure that we have that consistency in flow. And wherein the market previously has maybe placed the decision on which smaller black brokers to work with in the hands of the asset manager and in the hands of the bigger stockbroker, what we could do in this instance is rather reroute the direction and the mandate towards the small black broker to make sure that there is active involvement and that in fact it's not something that it's not hearsay, it's something that we are implementing. And the long-term results of that would be creating the kind of infrastructure that is required to enable the smaller brokers to grow, as well as diversifying the market and implementing a freer market. I think I'd made a note here or something. I believe that the disruption that we are experiencing that you spoke to earlier in our market is not necessarily a bad thing. It is perhaps an invitation for us to take a seat back and have conversations such as these that we are having and saying, how do we change the infrastructure of our market and how do we make the kind of cohesive decisions that will help us to make sure that tomorrow we have a market that is demonstrative of a free market as well as a transformed market. And perhaps it was the keynote speaker that spoke first, and he made mention that what runs the industry is the relationship and the performance. And in as much as I have an appreciation for that, I would like to challenge us to have a conversation about competence. If you take myself as an example, you very aptly put it when we were sitting down that I am newly appointed. I would not have the kind of relationships that my colleagues at the stage would have, but that's not a question of competence. So at a minimum, open the doors, have the conversations, take those meetings, find out what these small brokers are able to provide, and then challenge them on the basis of competence, not perception or the lack or the availability of relationships alone.
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge in general of trying to comply and support transformation in South Africa versus trying to get your business needs met and that short-term goals, versus the long-term investment. And I think it's quite a fine balance that we all have to start thinking about for what does the next 5 years or 10 years look like in South Africa. Just going back to you, Nivedna, so one of the things we have highlighted throughout the conversation is the business broker model viability. Now we spoke of partnerships, massive impediments in a fixed cost base, and with the pace of change of innovation and disruption, technology investment, right-sizing your business is all important. Can you just highlight, what would you say are some of the major changes that are required to enable a viable business broking model at the moment?
Okay, I think before I get on that, I think the other piece from a regulatory perspective, what's also affecting us is the lack of execution thereof.
Yeah.
So in the last kind of 8 years almost, we've been talking about a lot of the FMA, etc. So that doesn't really help the situation. Certain regs seems to be passed, and there's certain components that are not passed, which doesn't give certainty in terms of how we need to move forward. Just on the broking kind of model, so obviously we have retail and institutional combined at SBG Securities and Standard Bank. So in the last kind of 4 years, I think we've done really well to understand how we partner between our retail franchise, the institutional franchise, even broader from a markets perspective, being the FI, as I would like call it, and third-party technology providers. So when you're looking, and obviously everyone's nuanced, some are only retail brokers and some are only institutional brokers. I think when you take the step back, you need to look at what works for you and not only copy and paste other of the big houses, what you can own and control and what your strengths are, and then where you can leverage of other people's capabilities. So internally for us, we've done that quite well, but it's not the same cookie cut approach. So I can't say it may work for Viwe compared to where we sit, because we have access to a lot more, but how we cross over each other, and when she may have a strength in her business model and where we can kind of partner. But there's a lot, but again, we all in our silo and kind of engaging separately. So, yeah.
The platform is here to engage.
Yeah. So hopefully we can get there at the coffee break network.
Yeah. So we speak a lot about bringing down the overall cost of trade, and that's because the flows are thinner, the margins are more compressed, and then the partnership model, so how do you get more scale? Yes, we probably will get a more concentrated and consolidated industry. I know James gave us staggering stats of 40% off book, and in South Africa, at the JSE, we still quite pleased to have north of 85, closer to 90% on book in our trade activity, but notwithstanding, there's many fragmented options now. Matt, you spoke about, the possibility of considering a more tiered broking model in whatever that could look like. And Erica, you had mentioned, do we stick to a wholesale model, or do we try and spread our wings? And then overarching of all of this is then the disruptions of even the asset classes, where we see new asset classes rise up and catch up flows. So Matt, I was just wondering if you could shed some light in a wholesale tiering broking model for South Africa. What do you think would be an opportunity for change for us? We also mentioned CCP, and we mentioned how the ex-con had moved offshore assets offshore, but things like even CCP could bring up remote membership options. And then we have to also consider, do we have onshore or offshore presence of some of our key brokers here? But what do you think in the medium term, short to medium term, could be changes that we can enable in either better tiered broking models or wholesale broking models that will change the industry a bit? And then what does that mean for the broker-client relationship? How would that look?
Look, I think if you enable passporting or people to trade into the market, I think you've got a way that'll forget what it'll do to liquidity versus what it'll do to the market. I do feel like a lot of the internationals will then base a lot of the teams offshore, so I think it'll have quite a material impact on the market. I think you've seen that examples of that in other markets as well around the world, where the moment they allow passporting or trading in, you see a change in how they manage, let's say, their geographic exposure and teams out there. So I'm not sure that is a solution. And I don't know if it's going to bring more liquidity, it's going to bring new players into the market. I think that a lot of, if you think about a lot of the international banks are here or have been here and are choosing not to be here or just trade through a local broker. So I think, I don't think that changes much at all. I think on the wholesale broking model, I think we probably need to look at what we're seeing abroad and overseas. I think that in a lot of the markets offshore, and I alluded to earlier, because you've got such a dominance from the top 4 or 5 players globally, and that's in the US, Europe, and Asia. And they're so far ahead in terms of their cost of execution and their technology stack and what they can do, that you've got the smaller sort of, let's say, retail brokers or niche players access those large brokers and use them, and because their skill set, or let's say, their differentiating factor is their distribution channel and their network and their client network. It's not to go and invest a huge amount of money into your execution capability. So what they're doing is they're focusing on what their niche is, where they can add value, and they're focusing on that, and they don't running this huge fixed cost base that a broking license requires and the technology investment requires in maintenance. They've got now a variable cost base, let's say, execution model, and it's working for them. And we're seeing that play out globally in different markets. Now, that's not to say that individual market players in different markets are very important, and I think they've got a huge role to play, because I think there's great vendors out there that can offer a lot of this technology and equipment. And I think that, as James said earlier, that they have the client relationships, they're able to access the liquidity, get the tickets. So there's definitely different roles to play in the ecosystem. So, but I do think, given how onerous the requirements are, that it's becoming more and more difficult. I mean, where a lot of the international players are making their money from is from the platform clients, so the systematic trading clients, and we haven't really seen a growth in those kind of clients in our market share. I mean, if you look at the hedge fund industry here in totality, we haven't really seen a huge growth in the hedge fund industry even prior to Reg 28 over a decade. So we're not going to get, let's say, a lot of those platform clients coming in here until the macro turns, and they trade through a lot of the internationals. But I'd say that on a tiered broking model, I think we need to look at what's worked in various developed markets.
Yeah, thank you. And happy to take on the challenge collectively as an exchange, sitting as a facilitator and as an ecosystem where it's your businesses that make sense to a model that we can help replicate or scale in South Africa. We're almost out of time, but there is a question. It was actually a good question to end on, if that's our only question, because it's how our panel prep ended, which was we're rolling up our sleeves. We're starting top down in terms of trying to get a macro narrative change, lots of effort, all the way from the private public sector conversations that we're having about the macro top down. What are the initiatives, whether it's getting off the FATF grey list or whether it's just generating the investable opportunities into the country. We're working on some of the reg reforms where relevant, and then trying to bring in relevant product. Matt, we're trying to still push on the exchange controls to say, can we get multi-currency listings here so that we don't get our money put offshore and we have more onshore product management. But the question that's come up, and I will pose this to maybe all the panelists in their concluding remarks, is what gets the collaboration going? It says beyond the 10:40 comfort break. We won't make you have a working tea break. But what gets the collaboration growing? And is this something that can be facilitated? I mean, people are asking, I think, more formally by SAIS or the JSE. And then how do you actually unlock that, I think, for the ecosystem as a whole? So maybe we'll go around the houses to make it more deliberate in your concluding remarks as well. And then we can take it from there. Erica, Viwe, Nivedna, and then Matt.
So without a doubt, I think we have been working on it. The problem is we have to start actually acting on it. You can't carry on talking about it continually. So we have a vision from a shared service perspective. The members, there's corporate members, they're all involved. We meet regularly about the shape of this shared service, how we can use vendors, how we can use some of the big tech. It's about that partnership. It's about collaboration. It's about working together. But it's actually about putting something concrete in place and going forward, because that's the only way it's going to work. So we have to form partnerships. We have to actually work together in collaboration. We don't all have the right skills. But again, we go back to, and we've had this discussion about ownership of the shared tech, is where does the ownership lie? Does everybody feel part of it? Does everybody feel like they have a say in it? Does everybody feel like they're contributing towards it? And so that they're driving it. And so it's driven by a collective mindset and not necessarily for one person's own benefit. And so collectively, between ourselves as industry associations and exchange and regulators, I think we have to sit back and be honest and saying, okay, what is it we need? What is important? Where do we start decoupling? Are there places that we can decouple? But who is all going to contribute, and how are we going to contribute collectively and correctly? You can't expect one person to contribute and then not be part of it. So I think, or not have the right say. So if people are happy to contribute and work together and actually move something forward, we are trying to do something like that as an industry. But it's continuously working together to understand one bite at a time. I think we looked at it the other day and we said, there's just so much to do. If we had, each of us had 3 things, what would it be? And everybody had a different thing. And they're just so important and so massive that you actually have to take a step back and just take one step at a time, because every small step makes a big difference.
Yeah. And in general, some markets are getting it right. I think where they don't have policy, it just naturally you can be braver. Markets like Saudi, clean slate in Ethiopia, although it will be a longer time to design. Okay, great. Viwe.
That is terribly distracting.
Oh, we want to... We've run out of time.
Yeah, a collaborative approach is definitely the way for us to go. And where we have previously each to his own kept to our part of the market and what it is that we're focused on, that approach is not going to help at all. If the point is to make sure that we have a sustainable future in capital markets, then we also can't expect only the JSE or only SAIS to be the one that is charging the conversation. What we need to do is create platforms such as these where we can all plug in, and the different players in the different part of the markets can then have their contributions in as far as with the direction that we're looking to take, considering the impact of one stakeholder down the value chain, so that at any given point in time, the conversation is cohesive, it is inclusive of everyone that is in the value chain, and it is making sure that we have sustainability in our markets.
Thank you, Viwe. Nivedna?
So I think there's no short of industry bodies and the exchange facilitating. I think the lack of execution and practically where we need to start, collectively we haven't got there. So if I have to say this is the outcomes we need to achieve in the next 3 years, collectively no one has that same answer. So that piece for me needs to be solved through the relevant kind of forums, because I don't think that's the lack of. The 3-year view and the 5-year view of exactly what we want to be is lacking for me, so they can really enable practical steps to get there. So I think in those relevant forums, that's what we need to take back.
Yeah, thanks. Matt, your concluding remarks, but you can also pick up question 2, which is the future of how does research from sell-side feature in this discussion? And I guess it's a whole unbundling and then now bundling again that's being proposed. So yeah, you can end on those 2 points. Thanks.
Just on the first point, I think that there's a lot of collaboration that takes place in pockets, but I think it's mainly private side collaboration. And I think that if you're seeing what's happening in other areas of government and private side collaboration, I think we need to leverage off that and really get, sort of the government guys in the room as well, with the regulators and stuff, because I feel like all these industry bodies and discussions we have, it's all private sector, and that's for me needs to change. On the question 2, it's about, I'll just read it to the room. So it's, how does research from sell side feature in this discussion in an environment where research coverage, breadth and quality is being impacted by deteriorating economics for brokers? Is quality and breadth of research likely to be more valued to buy side in the future again? So, I mean, it's an interesting question, because I think, even if you look at the FM and participation in the annual sort of ranking the analysts, where it was 10 years ago, and the breadth of coverage and the quality of research we had versus what we have today, it's a material difference. And you can argue that it's been driven by commission compression and economics and the what the commercials look like for running a research team. And I think that there's been a lot of evolution on the buy side as well. They've sort of built out their teams and created bigger research teams and analysts internally. I think that there's still very much a place for research in the market. I know this is an execution conference, so there is definitely, for differentiated content, I think there's still a value attached to it. I think if you speak to the corporates, they find it very valuable. I think that if you think about, other players that don't, let's say internationals, when they do come back, they don't have the ability and time to cover the breadth of the market. So they're very reliant on, let's say, the sell side and the sell side research, to come into the market, to get a better understanding, and it brings them up the curve a lot quicker. So particularly from international participation, there is definitely a role to play. And I think locally as well, I think there is, I'd like to say that commission rates will go back up to the old days of 20%, 20 basis points, 20% would be low. But I don't know if that's not going to happen. So I think that, if you look at a lot of the international banks and a lot of the global players, the research costs are borne by the whole group and not just the stockbroking. So there's a franchise benefit to a group, whether it's let's say your corporate relationships, whether it's your institutional buy-side relationships, to having a research team and having the breadth of coverage. So I like to think it'll still play a role in the market.
Yeah. Or this is where maybe public sector gets involved and we'd be like Namibia, and then we can put 25 basis points as our commission rate set by government. That would work. And on the research question, I think as is with any disruption, we're certainly saying we want to stimulate a growth segment, a small and mid-cap mindset, and just general flows and activity there, which we're not feeling, but then there's no coverage as well. So it's an invidious cycle of how you get visibility. But again, I would challenge us to think differently and work on what could be scalable models in some type of coverage or some type of almost dangling a carrot in terms of what's available for trade to get interest in, and then figure out how they grow and scale. Else we can just leave it to ChatGPT for giving us research reports. But it's been a great conversation and valuable insights. I think the takeaway here is it's an ecosystem problem and an ecosystem initiative to get us going. So I look forward to the challenge, because we all have a lot to gain and a lot to unlock in South African capital markets. So really look forward to the conversations and the work streams hereafter. So thank you for the time.